Haven't seen a spooky stories thread in a while, so I'll start. One of my favorite parts of this board was reading spook shit. Let's bring this back. Be me, 14 years old. Visiting redneck aunt and cousins in Oklahoma, middle of nowhere. Dad and younger sister came with me. So retarded they stopped educating their kids, cousin my age is one of the dumbest people I've met, etc. First 2 nights of the visit are completely normal if not a little boring. Aunt is obsessed with guns. Keeps a loaded one in every room. What ta fuck. Jpg. Find it weird but just think it's redneckery. Day 3 rolls around, myself, my cousin and some of his friends do some fishing and swimming in a small pond near their house. We swim until it gets dark, just teenagers fucking around and having a good time. Keep hearing noises from the tree line at the other end of the pond. Faint smell of something really bad, like a carcass blowing its fumes downwind. Cousin says it's just deer. Okay lol. We pack into his friend's geo-tracker and go back to cousin's place for the night. Bad smell follows us back to my aunt's place. Her horses seem really restless that night. I was kept up most of the night hearing them from the barn. Wake up at noon to an empty house. Bad smell is gone, so is everyone else. Cousin went to help with his stepdad's farm work, Dad went with his sister and my sister to a mall. Nobody woke me up. Bored as hell due to 1 bar of service on my phone. Fuck it, laced up my boots, decided I wanted to see more of my aunt's 15-acre property, since I'd only really been in her house the first few days. I'm done green texting now, fuck that shit. There was a small body of water pretty close to my aunt's house in her front yard, and just past that was about 80 yards of trees followed by a clearing that her horses usually stood in during the day. I set my sights on walking some of the trails I could see just inside the tree line. The way that the trees separated my aunt's yard from the clearing was weird, because it connected to a forest that spread across multiple properties in the area. Most of them were just being sat on by realtors and not being used, so I wasn't too worried about being caught by some redneck moron with a gun. Full disclosure though, trespassing on random property is probably not the smartest idea. I kept following one of the faint trails deeper and deeper into the trees for about 45 minutes or so. My playlist kept me company on my nature walk. It was pretty nice until I started noticing the bones peppering the dirt beside the trail. At first it was only a few, so few that I didn't even register that I kept seeing more the further I went down this path. They weren't human bones or anything spooky like that, so I figured probably just some animals' leftovers and kept trekking onwards. I used to hike a lot, from ages 6 to 12, so seeing animal bones on a trail wasn't that weird. Pretty normal actually. What wasn't normal, however, was the fact that the deeper I went into these trees, the more bones were riddled alongside the trail. Not even just along it, but all around me in those woods. I pulled out one of my earbuds to actual dead silence when I started really thinking about what I was seeing around me. I immediately yanked the other one out when I realized I couldn't hear anything. Not the rustle of leaves in the wind, not the singing of birds, not a distant branch snapping. Dead. Fucking silence. I don't normally listen to music at higher volumes, so I know it wasn't just my ears adjusting to a lack of sound. It was really, really quiet out there. At this point my heart was jumping out of my chest. Dead silence is usually a pretty bad sign while you're alone in the sticks in the middle of the day. Not only was it silent, but I noticed something weird about the bones too. Most of them were laying together, like the animals had keeled over there and just rotted, but a few were tied together with what looked like sinew. Really old sinew. The further I walked and the more I kept looking, the more of these little bundles of bones stuck out to me, and they weren't just on the ground anymore either. Some of them were tied to tree branches, some of them were tied to the animal skeletons on the ground, and a few errant ones stuck out of distant tree hollows. In spite of everything my guts were telling me, I kept following the trail. Partially out of boredom, as I really didn't have much else to do, and partially again out of morbid curiosity. Where I was at first a bit worried that I was walking on a hunting animal's trail, like a mountain lion, but I convinced myself otherwise with the logic that there weren't any mountains around here. And my aunt probably wouldn't keep horses if there were signs of some predatory animal stalking around her property. I knew my cousin's older brother had a hobby of whittling bones and antlers, so I convinced myself that the bone bundles were probably just targets for shooting that he had forgotten to take down before moving out of her house the year prior. What actually convinced me to turn around and head back to my aunt's place was the fact that the breeze picked up briefly, and I caught an awful smell. Like something was rotting upwind. It was a really acrid smell that I swear burned some of my nose hairs off. That and the prick cling I felt all over my body, shit had me so weirded out that I was covered in goosebumps before I even realized it. I grabbed one of the bone bundles I saw laying next to one of the skeletons that were all around me and walked right the fuck back out of there. By the time I got back it was around 3 p.m, and everyone but my cousin was back in the house. Not much of note happened, but I remember asking my aunt if her son, the older cousin, had ever made targets or anything like the bundles I saw out in the woods. She was confused, so I fished around in my bag and pulled out the little figure made out of bones and she had literally no clue. Weirded me the fuck out again. FFW to the next day and I'm asking my cousin about the trail and the bones, trying to see if maybe he'd go with me to do some target practice on the bones. Now, when I say this kid was stupid as a box of rocks, I mean it. My aunt pulled him out of school in 5th grade and repeatedly lied to the state telling them that she was homeschooling him. She was concerned about wokeness or whatever the fuck. So I'm telling him about what I saw on the trail and he's confused as hell too, said that he's followed that trail but really only to the property line because his mom said she'd tear him a new one if she had to pay charges for trespassing. Or worse, had to take him to the hospital with a bullet wound. I called him a pussy and, determined to prove me wrong, we set out back down the trail the next day. After about an hour of walking we made it back to where I started seeing the bones, although it wasn't nearly as quiet this time around. My cousin, without telling me, had brought a small slingshot along on this walk, and decided now was a great time to whip it out and started shooting the little bone figures. Hearing the crack of the bones shattering from the rock he sent towards the first one nearly made me jump out of my skin, mainly because he had been walking behind me the whole time. So we keep walking for about 10 more minutes, deeper into the woods, when he noticed something and pointed it out to me. Just far enough ahead that I could barely make it out was a concrete mound in the ground. Needless to say we were running towards whatever this thing was. Eventually we got close enough to see that it wasn't so much of a mound as it was a concrete box with a door. All around the perimeter were more of those little bone figures, and we were psyched to have found this. While the schoolyard talk of a hidden bunker in my cousin's backyard was filling our heads and leaving our mouths, we thoroughly investigated the thing. From a distance, we couldn't really make out the markings on it. Getting up close, however, it was obvious what we had found. An old tornado shelter. This thing had taken a beating too. There were chips all over the concrete. Chips and marks from all sorts of animals, hoof marks, claw marks, everything and anything. Raccoon paws, cloven hooves, etc. Shit was really weird. The weirdest part though was the door. It wouldn't budge. The both of us took turns trying to wrench it open, using rocks to try to pry the thing open, but it didn't move. Its rusty visage felt almost like it was mocking us. What use was there for a tornado shelter that you can't even get into? My cousin, in his genius, decided that the best course of action was to line up a few cans we had emptied on the top of the thing, and to shoot them with his slingshot. I stood by him rolling the little effigy I'd kept with me around in my hand, and waited for him to get done fucking around with the slingshot, until he shot the door. I don't understand how or why, but it rang out like a fucking gunshot. We both jumped about 10 feet in the air and nearly pissed ourselves with how loud that shit was. While we were looking at each other like WTF. He noticed something over my shoulder. I turned to meet the direction of his gaze and saw it. Hanging from one of the lower branches on a tree about 30 feet out, was the skin of some animal. My cousin said it was deer hide. At this point he's scared shitless that some hunter had skinned a deer that had been killed around here and that would get caught for trespassing, so we basically booked it out of there, probably ran for like 15 minutes before we slowed down to a jog, and then eventually to a brisk walk. The bad smell didn't come back until later that night, when we had already been back from our walk for a few hours. He didn't tell his mom how far we had went into the woods, mainly due to him not wanting to get his ass handed to him with a belt, and we had a pretty normal rest of our evening until about 8 p.m. My aunt loved sitting around the fire pit on her deck right out front, so there we were that evening, roasting marshmallows and shooting the shit with each other, having a good time, when my cousin tells me he wants to show me something. His mom instantly spoiled the surprise and told me that he was going to show me the deer in the clearing by her house. See, he did this thing pretty frequently where he'd climb a tree at the edge of the pasture and just wait until they'd come to graze at night just after the sun would come down. Said he'd use that branch crook as a hunting platform once he got his own gun. So, we went to his tree spot to watch some deer that evening. We sat and waited for about 15 minutes before we noticed a few deer walking into the opening, but something was wrong. Like, you could feel it in the air how wrong that something was. You could smell it too. He whispered something to me about how it might rain soon because an almost ozone-esque smell mixed with something else entirely was just filling our noses. Something inside me knew better though. That rotting smell was back, and even worse than when I had been hiking. Its pungent odor made my head spin, and my cousin even gagged a few times. It smelled like rotting meat, iron, and something pretty similar to ozone. We were both whispering really quietly to each other while waiting, but had shut right the fuck up when we saw the deer. Now that they'd been out in the clearing for a few minutes, he said something about the smell that was pretty obviously on the both of our minds. Dude, it smells like shit, let's go back inside. So we did. We climbed down the tree, hitting the ground as softly as we could possibly manage. None of the deer seemed to notice or care, with the exception of one. One of them had been shambling a bit when it had walked over with its herd, and he had told me it was probably just injured. I shit you not, this injured deer stood right up on its hind legs and fucking stared us down. It didn't move, it didn't even look like it was breathing. It just stared right into my fucking soul. My cousin, in his vast redneck intelligence, said fuck it and just started yelling and waving his arms while running towards the herd. All of them scattered like a handful of marbles dropped onto a tile floor, all except for the injured one. It stood exactly where it had been standing for the past minute and a half and seemed completely unfazed by my cousin's genius attempt to scare them off. At this point I'm shitting bricks, sweating bullets, and quaking like an aspen in the wind, and he's on the same page as me. I tell him we should go back inside and he says yeah, good idea. We both walked the 10 minutes back towards my aunt's house, looking over our shoulders every minute or so. By the time we got back, my aunt and sister had retired into the house for the night. The bad smell never did go away, even after we went inside. My cousin still thought it was an injured animal acting weird. He told me it could be an odd case of chronic wasting disease. I knew he was just bullshitting to put our minds at ease, but I still had a lot of trouble getting to sleep that night. The dream I had was crazy and vivid too. I dreamt that I was in my neighborhood at home, in the middle of the night, walking with my older sister and her friends, one of whom I had never met before. We had snuck out, and were looking to score some pot from her dealer. We keep walking and following the GPS on her phone, but the streets keep shifting. Like, you'd walk one way and somehow end up where you started. Not only that, but there were no cars on the road. I say fuck the pot, let's go home, she says no, so I say okay, well, I'm going home, and start walking. I round one corner and the street she was just on vanishes, like gone without a trace. If it wasn't obvious to me before, the dream really became a nightmare then. As hard as I tried to get back to my house, I couldn't find the street I lived on. The harder I looked, the more I realized I was being stalked by a man in the distance. At first I could barely see him, but he moved quicker than any human should have been able to. Around the third time I had looked back to see him, he was close enough that I could tell he was just standing still. He was too far to make out his face, but still I could tell that he wasn't moving. Or, not while I was looking at him anyways. And then there it was again. That fucking smell. The rotting flesh and iron and electricity that penetrated my nostrils and sinuses. ATP, I'm running down streets, but dream running, so not even getting anywhere that quickly. Heart is pounding because some random man is following me in the dead of night and I'm all alone. Eventually he gets close enough that I can hear him in the distance, speaking absolute gibberish. Absolute gibberish in my cousin's voice. It's probably got chronic wasting disease or something, I don't know. Anon, it's got chronic wasting disease. Anon, wasting, hunting, Anon, etc. After a certain point the man just kept repeating my name in varying pitches. It scared the shit out of me. Looking back on it now I still get the heebie-jeebies. I woke up at about 3:45 in the morning to use the bathroom, also partially to avoid going back to sleep, and the instant I turned the lights on in the bathroom I heard something heavy booking it away from the front door. My aunt's house isn't really a sizable building by any means, probably only about 800 square feet, so my dad has to sleep in my aunt's trailer hooked up to her truck for when she travels with her horses. In my half-awake state I think, what the hell is my dad doing out there, and pass back out for another few hours. No spooky dreams this time though. Wake up in the morning and everything seems normal again, although I'm still spooked from the events of the previous night. My cousin goes, I know what'll cheer you up, and tells me we're gonna go swimming again. Personally, I love swimming, and if you've ever been in the middle of nowhere in the American South you know exactly how miserable the heat is during the summer, hence why swimming is so great for the summer months. We load back into his friend's Geo-Tracker and head up the road off her property for a bit before turning down a rough trail into some trees. The truck actually got stuck heading up there, but with a few minutes of pushing we were back on our way to this new swimming area. They were hyping it up, talking about how much fun it'll be, and I'm confused because although I like swimming, whatever they had planned couldn't be that great. I was very wrong. We drove through one of their neighbors' pastures on an off-roading track, careful to not scare the cows we were heading past, when they parked and told me that we had arrived. I was confused as hell, because we were walking uphill. As we keep walking, my cousin breaks out into a sprint and keeps running full speed towards the crest of the hill, until he jumps and plunged over the edge of the horizon. The splash that followed answered my question immediately. They had brought me cliff diving. It wasn't a huge cliff, probably only about a 35-foot drop, but nonetheless it was great. The shitty part was climbing back up. It was a pretty sheer climb up some jagged rocks and involved a bit of caution around some prickly bushes that were around the area they had over the years carved out a trail in. I decided after about 2 hours of this that I was going back to the truck, mainly because my feet got cut up by the multiple climbs back up to the jumping spot. I have no shame in admitting my skin is that of a city slickers, so I went back towards the truck to change into dry clothes and check my phone. Although I didn't have any texts, my cousin's phone had a few missed calls from his mother and a slew of texts. I call him over to look and he's freaking out. His mom says one of her horses got out. Vanished into thin air, pretty much, and she thinks he's responsible since he feeds the horses in the morning. So he's freaking out because she's pissed that her horse is missing, and we all headed back pretty much right away. While his mom was chewing him out for letting the horse get out, his friends went home. So now it's about 3 p.m, and he's set out with his mom to look around their property for this missing horse. It's just gone. Not so much as a horseshoe was left behind. They kept looking until around the time the sun came down, and in that time some weird stuff transpired. I haven't mentioned this yet because I don't like speaking ill of the dead, but my father was a pretty big alcoholic. He'd drink and drink and drink until he blacked out, and there was no moving him or getting anything out of him once he was knocked out. About an hour after my aunt left with my cousin, my dad stumbled through her front door drenched in sweat, half awake, and promptly collapsed on the couch that I had been sleeping on for the past few nights of the visit. My aunt and cousin came home just before the sun set, and my aunt is really frustrated that her multiple $1,000 animal had just dropped off the face of the earth. Naturally, she decided to leave the house for the evening and went to go spend the night at her boyfriend's place. Almost as soon as her truck left the driveway, the stomach-turning smell from before returned, and it was even stronger than it had ever been. Almost like when you stick your nose right in the center of a flower and you get the full scope of its scent. That's the best way I can really describe it. In the previous days we had experienced this, the iron smell was kind of off. Now that the noxious odor was right up in our faces, we both recognized what the smell was. The iron smell was blood. I don't know how, maybe it's because I was scared shitless, but it reeked like blood and rotting meat and fucking ozone. Then the stomping began. What sounded like someone pacing around outside started up, and I swear to God I heard it fucking whispering. My cousin is unfazed by these noises, and tells me it's just our donkey. He gets out of his pen sometimes. I tried to get him to hear the whispering, but we couldn't hear shit over my father's deviated septum snores. He calmed me down by getting some pot from his older brother's old study, and we smoked a joint to chill out. By the time we finished it, it was about 10 p.m. and I was pretty tired. The whispering and pacing had chilled out a bit too, to the point that I had convinced myself I was hearing shit. So, I said my goodnights to him and my sister, and decided I was going to retire to the now open queen-size bed inside the trailer. I opened the front door to my aunt's house and immediately heard a crack. I nearly jumped out of my skin until I realized it was because I had stepped on something. I looked down under where I had just set my foot and found a bundle of bones, shattered by the weight of my body. In my high and exhausted state, I thought to myself, oh must drop this, whoops lol, swept the pieces off of the doormat with my shoe, and kept heading towards the trailer. Although it still smelled really bad, whatever was doing the thumping had ran off into the night as soon as I had opened the door, which is partially what convinced me in that moment that it was the donkey, because he'd do this during the day. So I was a bit less worried about some weird thing out in the night. It was only after I was in the trailer for a few minutes that I realized why my father had decided to sleep on the couch that night. The air conditioning was shut off inside the trailer and it was sweltering. So I'm trying to get comfortable in there, laying in just my underwear and trying to load up a YouTube video to fall asleep to, when I heard it again. The pacing noises came back and they were louder than before. All I could smell in that trailer was my own sweat mixing with the horrible odor coming from just outside the door. Suffice to say I was sweating like crazy, partially because of the temperature and partially because I was being followed by something big and scary. I was trying to think logically about what could be out there, why the donkey might be pacing around the trailer, when it started knocking. Knocking and fucking speaking. At first it was my cousin's voice, just saying my name over and over. Asking me to let it in, asking me to stop hiding in there. I laid as still as a corpse on that mattress, but it didn't matter. It kept knocking. And kept knocking. Asking me to come out. I texted my cousin, and got no response. I called him, no response. He was asleep. Whatever was out there must have heard the dial tone, because it got pissed. Really pissed. The pacing sped up to the point that it almost sounded like multiple people were outside the trailer, and the banging on the walls and door were so intense I could see the walls reverberating from the repeated impacts. I almost thought it was throwing itself into the trailer, because the whole fucking thing was shaking with every hit. It went on for what felt like an eternity, until it subsided just as quickly as it had began. I had heard the pacing stop just to the right of my head, and remembered that there was a window with a curtain in the little loft area where the bed was situated. Directly to my right, where cool air had been flowing in through the netting on the window and between the cracks of the curtains, it grew warm and foul, stagnated to the point that I nearly choked. I had been so preoccupied with watching the door and making sure its lock didn't come undone that I didn't even notice the curtains had a crack in them, and the lack of cool air flowing through them drew my attention. I turned my head to look through the crack, when I saw my aunt's horse staring back at me with a singular bloodshot, sunken, very human eye. I didn't have to guess as to what was out there anymore. It was a skinwalker. I stopped a yelp from leaving my mouth, grit my teeth, and shut the window by grabbing the edge through the curtain as calmly as I could manage, and then I shut the gap in the curtains. This sent the thing into a fucking rampage. It was screaming in my cousin's voice and rocking the trailer with every hit. I honestly don't know if I pissed myself that night. The delirium of the heat exhaustion and the panic of one of those things being out there had my head spinning like a top. I just know I sat in that trailer for fucking hours, listening to this thing trying its damnedest to drive me out of my sleeping accommodation until the sun came up. My phone had died at about 12 a.m. that night, and I wish I had the foresight to record literally any of what had happened, but alas, I was a retarded teenager. At about 4:50 a.m. when the sun's rays first crested the horizon line, the thing took off at light fucking speed. Seriously, I have no clue how it was able to move that fast. The bad smell receded from being overpoweringly acrid to being a faint note that hung in the air over my aunt's house. I immediately put on a pair of pants and shoes, and tried to see if any evidence of the evening before had been left. I walked around the trailer about 20 times while shirtless before the exhaustion got the better of me, and went back into the trailer to pass out. I didn't sleep long, mainly because I had the same dream as the night previous. I was back home, being stalked again. This dream was different though. The man was shaking with rage and heaving his shoulders up and down. He demanded that I give it back in my aunt's voice, which scared the dickens out of me. I woke up at around noon again, covered in sweat and wondering if I had just dreamt up the events of the night before. When I had fully come to, I realized I was sleeping on something lumpy and uncomfortable in my pocket. I reached in tentatively to feel what was annoying me in my dreams, and a bundle of smooth sticks met my fingers. The effigy was still in my pocket. I bolted upright and smacked my head on the ceiling of the trailer's loft, which sent me reeling back down for a few seconds. As I was waiting for my skull to stop throbbing, I put on the shirt I had laid on the ground the night before in an effort to get comfortable. I pretty much flew out of that trailer door. Never before had I been so happy to be free of a space like that. I almost set my boot down on another one of those bone effigies, but caught myself at the last second. Instead, I scooped it up and put it in my pocket with the other one. I began walking back towards the house to tell my cousin what had transpired the previous evening, when I noticed another effigy. And another. Yet again another. The first one I noticed around the house was directly under the window to my aunt's laundry room, and just to its left there was one sitting right smack dab in the middle of the path beneath the door to her laundry room. Another under the front door, next to the one I had broken the night prior. I walked all the way around her house and must have found 8 or 9 of the damn things. I walked through her front door, pushing past my dad, and went directly to my cousin's room. He was gone. My phone was still dead, so I put it on the charger. While I waited for it to charge, I talked to my father to ask if he knew where my cousin had went. He told me that at about 8 that morning, his mother had taken him with her to go look for her missing horse on their neighbor's property. I knew in my heart that they weren't going to find it. Not alive, anyways. What I did next was probably the dumbest fucking thing I think I ever could have done. I took a shower, put on some clean clothes, laced up my boots, and started back down the trail I had so eagerly followed a few days prior. It made itself very clear in the dream, it wanted for something that I had taken from it to be given back. I still had its effigy. My father, in addition to his alcoholism, was nigh amazing atheist levels of cringe with how little he believed in the supernatural. I knew he wouldn't believe me if I answered him honestly when he asked where I was going at the door, so I simply responded, on a hike. I know now that you're ideally not supposed to walk directly into the territory of a predator, but what else could I do? It was the only way I could think to curb the wrath of whoever had been out there. I started back down the trail and immediately noticed that it was dead silent before I had even left her lawn. I was being stalked. The odor never really left me alone on my walk, it was just present enough that a breeze would pick up and I'd get assaulted nasally by the smell of blood and decay. With each step I took, moving ever forwards into the winding trees, the smell grew stronger. Every now and then I'd hear a distant scream, but never from the same location. It'd be way off to the right of me, or behind me the way I came. Eventually I got back to the bones, back to where I had found the effigies. The smell was vile and almost overpowering at this point. It knew I was there. I had walked right into its domain, defenseless. I might as well have laid down on a silver platter and put an apple in my mouth. These things have a weird way of manipulating the woods they inhabit. What had before been a 100-minute walk to the tornado shelter in the woods became a 30-minute walk. Without distractions, it was obvious to me how much shorter the walk was this time around. It had never wanted me to find the shelter in the first place, but I kept searching for any reason to be out there in my teenage hubris. As I kept walking closer to the shelter, the smell of blood became almost asphyxiating. The wind would pick up and the smell of iron and life would fill my head to the point that I could barely keep my balance. I've never had a weak stomach, but the smell was too much. I dropped to my knees to dry heave when I saw it about 60 yards ahead of me. A decapitated, skinless horse was laying in the dirt, caked in bloody mud with its intestines hanging out. Hanging in the tree beside it, was the horse's hide. My aunt's horse's hide. This time, I actually did vomit. I'm not normally squeamish, but I hate seeing people's pets get hurt. I hate seeing them dead even more. The combination of the overpowering smell and the visual of the slaughtered horse made my stomach give in to the nausea that had been nesting itself slowly into my mind. As I stood, wiping the bile from my lips, I remembered to take deep breaths in. As insulting to my senses as the air was, the oxygen helped gather my thoughts. I'm not a believer in any Abrahamic faiths, but during the last 5 minutes of that walk to the shelter I think I said about 100 different prayers. It's crazy how fear can influence you like that. On any other day I'd have been cursing God by 3 p.m. Only on that day did I actually beg forgiveness and safety from Him. My prayers must have been heard, because before I even registered it I was staring directly at the shelter. The door was cracked slightly, and the urge to vomit was getting larger by the second. The smell wafting out of that door genuinely gave me a migraine. I didn't want to open the door more than it had been. The last thing I wanted to do was piss this thing off while it was watching me. That, and I didn't want to see what it looked like under the animal skins. I screamed out into the air, "Take your fucking bones back. I'm sorry." Dropped the effigies I had gathered into my pockets, and sprinted as quickly as I could back down the trail. The path back was a blur of leaves and gnats as I ran with all the strength I could muster. I tripped once and heard a blood-curdling scream ring out behind me, which made me immediately launch back into a full sprint. By the time I had made it back to my aunt's house, I was covered in cuts and bruises. I didn't even realize until the adrenaline wore off, but I dislocated a finger when I tripped. It hurt like hell, but I set it back in place. After about 15 minutes of running, the woods were no longer silent, and the bad smell was gone. My cousin and aunt were home, and everyone asked me why I looked like shit. I told them that I had just tripped while hiking. I tried to tell my cousin what I had seen, and he laughed in my face saying, "You believe in skinwalkers? See mirror." He led me outside, and screamed the word skinwalker into the sky about 20 times. I winced, fearing some sort of retribution from the treeline, but nothing happened. No spooks ran at us, no shrieks, no smells. The birds didn't even quit singing. He just laughed, and told me I've been reading too many scary stories, and even got upset with me for trying to tell him I had seen his aunt's horse. He said, "Who would do that to someone's horse and not even go through the effort of eating it?" I realized at that point that my words were falling on deaf ears. Nothing else of note really happened during that visit, but I made sure to sleep inside for the few days that were left of the trip before my father drove my sister and I back home. My cousin told me that he went back down the trail after we had returned home, and that there was no horse in the dirt like I had said there was. There was just a shitty old tornado shelter with a door that wouldn't budge. I used to work as a tour guide at a haunted historic asylum. I've got a lot of stories, both my own and ones told to me. This one was told to me by a co-worker. Second floor of hospital has doors that lead to nowhere. Years ago, used to have a catwalk that lead to a cafeteria outside. Both catwalk and cafeteria are gone. Double doors are now locked, blocked off, with a tarp covering the outside. Years ago was a fire in the main building. No one died, used those double doors to leave. Fast forward to within recent years, little girl is taking a tour. Second floor, near double doors. Takes her mom's hand and points to them. Goes on to say that a monster was standing there, beckoning her to go through the double doors. No one else saw anything. Little girl insists the monster wanted her to go through the doors. Backstory: a bathroom in one of the wards is allegedly haunted by the ghosts of two teenage boys. Intelligent spirits will react and answer questions, etc. People leave them offerings of cigarettes, candy, powdered energy drink packets. The stalls in the bathroom are short, only coming up to someone's chest. Safety reasons. Co-worker and buddy were doing an electronic voice phenomenon session in that bathroom one night. Co-worker has built a rapport with the spirits, is just hanging out basically. His buddy suddenly freaks out and scrambles out of the bathroom. Near pitch blackness in ward, only light coming from outside. Buddy goes on to explain that in what little light there was, he saw two hands grip the top of the stall door behind my co-worker. Then a shadowy head. I was at a small party with the usual friends, and went into the basement, where one of my friend's brothers stayed. I found a machete, so stole it and put it in my backpack. I then walked home at around 3 a.m., taking the back roads, and cutting up through a field. I heard a loud noise, like pots and pans banging a lot, and heard a dog barking frantically. I looked towards the source of the noise, and a back porch had a bright light on. A tall, and we're talking what looked like 8 feet tall bipedal, pure black figure, wearing what looked like a robe and hood, or maybe just a kinda nondescript form, came racing from the porch. As soon as my eyes locked onto it firmly, it stopped in its tracks, its eyeless face seeming to look right at me. All I knew to do was slowly bend down and grab the machete from my pack, never removing my eyes from the being. It seemed like as long as I looked at it, it would just stay frozen in place. I thought, you can come and get me. I'm ready, machete in hand. We locked gazes for like a minute, which seemed like forever. I looked away to see what would happen, and it raced away from the direction of the porch, far faster than a human could. Be me, one of 2 historic guides there that shift. Usually we can get the haunted tour guide to join us in waking the ghosts. Alas, our ghost guy is nowhere to be found. Just me and the other guide. Go to 4th floor. Waking the ghosts is usually just us rapping our knuckles on the walls and floors. Usually we get responses, knocks back. It's considered polite to wake them up before tours, otherwise they get fussy. Her and I get some knocks and footstep sounds. Satisfied, we start to head back to the ground floor. Multiple fire escapes and stairs we can take. For some reason, we ignore the main staircase. We aren't talking, we're walking side by side to the fire escape. I'm still new, but she's been there for years. Her parents worked there. She knows this place like the back of her hand. Side by side we go down the fire escape. No idea why, we just go. Can't remember who reached for the door on the ground floor, but it's locked. We kinda look at each other then look to the door. It leads directly to lobotomy recovery. We look at our phones for the time. We have less than 5 minutes before the doors open. Couple has brought a dog on tour with them. Service animal, has a little vest and everything. Tour gets brought into this ward, where they set up Kinect cameras. Like the camera that overlays the stick figures over forms that it picks up. Service dog is not happy. Doesn't want to enter this part of the ward, is trying to pull its owner away from it. Basically signaling that something is not right. Later, upon viewing the footage, the camera had indeed picked up something. Like lots of little figures crawling up the walls. What do you mean? Like babies? Trainer and another guide were going through the building at night. Flashlight tours are going on, meaning it's just you, the group, a guide, and a flashlight. Pitch black hospital, pitch black hallways. If you don't know the building, you're fucked. Trainer and guide getting from point A to point B, pass by a tour group. He waves hello, makes a little joke, and they slip on by. Get back to home base, no big deal. They ask about the tour group that's still out. LMAO, what tour group? I was hiking near a US/NATO base, where I go frequently if I want to walk on a flat surface. This time it was nighttime. Kept hearing strange sounds coming from the woods. It was dark, my flashlight is only 400 lumens, so not much. Then the wind turned and I heard voices. They were American. I thought shit, it's security. For some reason they are on the exterior doing whatever, mind you they have zero jurisdiction, but might report me to the Waldkommissar/police and fine me for being in the woods late. Anyway, I hurried back to LE car and then I saw these two men. They were butt naked, one tied to the tree wearing his camo as a blindfold and the other guy standing behind him with the pants on his knees. It was a disgusting scene. They never even noticed me and I ran off quickly. The head and shoulders of a boy were slowly rising up from behind the stall door.
To the town of Anon, we rode a stranger one fine day. Hardly spoke to folks around him, didn't.
Are you a targeted individual? Have you had a paranormal encounter, or are the victim of an unregulated government experiment and would like to share your story with us? Would you like to send us some fan mail or a hate-filled rant? Do you have an idea for a future episode or wish to send a complaint to HR? Email us at atomicshamanSweatlodge@protonmail.com.
The earth is not flat, it's hollow, and there's Nazis in it. Shit, if that's true, you're probably gonna find me in it. Vibing while we fry Hasidics, ashes in the sky's the limit. I'm just rhyming with it. This is my demented mind, and y'all just climbed up in it. Every now and then I can get retarded.
Like, share, subscribe, and be sure to check the notification bell. Follow the Atomic Shaman on Twitter at Motel and RV Park. Listen to Paranormal Green Text Stories on Atomic Shaman TTS on YouTube. Catch the live streams of Atomic Shaman Sweat Lodge only on Rumble.